Welcome to IntelligentTalk.com. We're very happy to have Grace Kennan Warnicki. She's the author of a new book called Daughter of the Cold War. She's the daughter of arguably the most important diplomat in American history, at least of the 20th century, George Kennan, who I had the pleasure of meeting years ago. He wrote the famous Long Telegram to President Truman, which is the base of U.S. containment policy, and was expelled, actually, as ambassador to the Soviet Union by Joseph Stalin. So, Grace Kennan, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Well, Ralph, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. So, yes, I just gave a brief introduction. I'm not sure everyone knows, of course, who your father was, but he was a big influence on my life. I studied him when I was at Brown, and as I said, I had the opportunity to meet him back in 1988. Just want to go over with your life. You were born in Latvia, correct?
Right.
And your father was stationed there, right?
Yes, we didn't have an embassy then, but we had a legation, and my father was stationed in the legation, in the American legation. And my mother was Norwegian, and because we were stationed in Latvia, I was born in Latvia.
And then you moved around. Your father had diplomatic posts in Berlin and Vienna, correct?
Yes, in Berlin, and in Vienna, in Prague, in Portugal, and, of course, most of all, Moscow.
Yes, and you were actually there when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, I believe. You were an eyewitness to that.
I was.
Do you
very
have
small eyewitness.
a
very young eyewitness.
Very young eyewitness. Do you have?
But I did see Hitler, and there was such a point made of the fact that I was seeing Hitler, because he went by below our apartment in an open car after they had taken over Czechoslovakia.
Was it then your father was stationed to Berlin and later interned when the war started?
Yes, that was afterwards.
And then you were sent back to the United States, I believe,
yes,
right?
Yes, my sister and I went back. My sister Jonah and I went back to the United States.
And then later
with our mother, and then she came back again, I believe.
Yes, your mother, as you said, was Norwegian.
We were left with my father's sister in Highland Park, Illinois.
Okay, and of course, I met your mother too, and I remember her being very nice, and okay, as you said, she was from a small town, I believe, in Norway. Then you make your way back to the Soviet Union, actually, and you're in Moscow during the war, I believe. Is that right?
They were there from 44 to 46. I was there for a year, 44 to 45, and then I came back to the States to go to boarding school.
So when you were in Moscow, this is during World War II, this is under Stalin, do you have pretty vivid memories? You were the only, I believe, American in the class, right?
I was the only foreigner in the whole school.
Only foreigner in the whole school?
Not just American. I mean, there was nobody except me. And there was a Chinese who was the daughter of a famous Chinese communist. But I believe they were actually Soviet citizens. I mean, they lived there full time.
I mean, what a unique experience to have that. I mean, does that stand out? When you look back at that, does it seem like a pretty interesting part of your life? But probably not at the time, maybe?
Well, I just assume that what came along, when you're a child, you don't think in terms of, I didn't know how other people lived.
Right.
I only knew how we lived, and we lived constantly moving. I did not go to the same school twice, 2 years in a row until I was in the 11th grade. So I just assumed every year you went to a new school.
Okay. And
although I must confess I didn't like always being the new girl in the class.
Yes, I can imagine. Do you remember the times of being in Moscow during the war? Do you remember air raids and seeing military equipment? And
there weren't air raids then. It was 44 to 45, and the air raids were over.
Okay.
The Germans were retreating, and during that very dangerous time, the American embassy had been moved to a small town, and it had now come back to Moscow.
So that was not it was not Spaso House then, I guess. It was not.
No, there was Spaso House. Our ambassador was April Harriman, and he lived in Spaso House.
Because I had the opportunity.
And my father was the number 2 deputy chief of mission, as they call it, and we lived in an apartment in the embassy.
I remember how beautiful Spaso House was myself when I was there in the late 70s. It was owned by a Russian sugar czar, I believed, and taken over by the Americans in the 30s, I think, under Ambassador Bullitt, who was, I think, FDR's
That's right.
ambassador. So anyway, so now you have this unique experience. You come back to the United States. Your father is later brought back to the Soviet Union and expelled by Stalin, right? I believe in 52?
He was made ambassador in 1952, and it was while he was ambassador that he was expelled he was declared persona non grata, is the official terminology, by Stalin, yes.
Just in talking about your father, I've heard you several of your interviews. You interview on C-SPAN and other interviews you've done. And although your father could be like a remote figure, you were fairly close to him the times you spent together. Is that right?
Yes, I loved my father, and he really was wonderful with small children. He loved to tell stories. He made up games. He read aloud endlessly. I mean, he would read whole books aloud to us. He was often not there. I mean, there was one period in my life I didn't see him for 2 years, so I'm serious when I say he was not always there. But when he was there, what little time he had, he made life fun. He made life sort of come alive. And my mother, unfortunately, didn't have that particular gift, so I really appreciated it from my father.
Perhaps your father's most famous work was the so-called long telegram before becoming ambassador to Truman that basically said the Soviets were inherently expansionist and they had to be watched. And as you said, one of your interviews, that was a time when Roosevelt was calling him Uncle Joe and things like that. Did you ever talk to him about the long telegram and his seminal work on that, or your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think we had a conversation. After all, I was only 11 or something when that happened. But I'm very well aware of it. It was the longest telegram, I believe, has ever been sent to the State Department. It was over 8,000 words. And I've talked to people who watched it come in, and the word started going around the State Department. There's this telegram coming in, and it keeps coming and coming. And people, I gather, some people stood around and watched it coming in. In those days, security was a little different. And you could actually see the incoming telegrams. And it later became an article in Foreign Affairs in 1940. It in fact came out, the long telegram was in February of 1946, but then it came out in 1947 as an article in Foreign Affairs, and after that a sort of abridged version came out in Life magazine. But they didn't allow my father to, they wanted him not to have this attributed to him, so it was signed X. It was written anonymously, supposedly. And for a long time, it's often been called the X article. And when I first went to college, people who thought they were very clever would call me Miss X.
Yes.
Of course, I loved it.
That's a wonderful title. I mean, I remember when I had the one opportunity I had to meet your grandfather was summer of 1988 because I knew my grandfather, who had been also ambassador to the Soviet Union under Carter, and I got to spend the day with your father, and I talked to him, and basically what he affirmed is that after Stalin died, he sort of shifted and was no longer really the hawk of that X article, and it sort of became, I don't know if you would say a dove or a liberal, but he later opposed the Vietnam War and sort of took different positions. So is it, and then later, of course, even predicted the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think he told President Bush that, number one, as well in his office. But was your view that your father shifted his view after Stalin's death and really became more of a liberal?
No. And first of all, I think that they're two different things. As far as being liberal and conservative, he was always very conservative domestically, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
He was a liberal in the field of foreign policy, and he stayed a liberal. And that's why he was a liberal. He was against, he was horrified by war. He had gone, right after the war, he did a trip all through Europe, and he saw all that human and physical devastation that World War II caused. And I think it made an indelible impression on him. I mean, I grew up listening to him talk about how horrible war was. And so I think his anti-military policy came from a real horror of what he had seen. And don't forget, they lived in Europe, not in places that were being bombed, but we were in Europe. They were in Europe most of the war. And my Norwegian grandparents, my grandfather was interned in a camp in Kristiansand, Norway, he was tortured. I mean, the war was very real to them.
But is it fair to say that he became more accommodating towards the Soviets after Stalin's death and was in favor of negotiations and détente and all of that?
He was always in favor, even in the, that's the whole point. The whole point of the X article was that we didn't want to go to war with the Soviet Union, and therefore we should, keep talking to them. We just shouldn't idolize him. We shouldn't call him Uncle Joe and things like that. So it was a difference from when we were allies, but it wasn't that much of a difference.
In the well-known book, The Wise Men, which is about the 6 or so men that shaped the world after World War II, your father is quoted in there as not liking President Roosevelt. And I brought that up to him when I met him, and he basically, as I understand it, he thought the war should have been focused on Germany, not Japan. He thought that we sort of provoked Japan by having the embargo that we did of the oil on Japan. And he didn't have a high regard for FDR back in '88 when I met him. Was that your feeling, that those were his views on that?
Yeah, he had a lot of problems with FDR. You're absolutely right. And it started way back in 1937. All the embassy and everything we did with Russia was run by what was then called the Division of Eastern European Affairs in the State Department. And in 1937, Roosevelt abolished this and folded the Division of Eastern European Affairs into the Western European Division. Now, this might sound to you like bureaucratic nothing, but it meant a great deal to all those Russian experts that had grown up in the Division of Eastern European Affairs. It felt to them like a slap in the face. They had, for example, that division had a wonderful library, and they were so afraid the library would be lost that Chip Bolin took the books and hid them in his house. I mean, it was this much drama was going on. He also, my father, I think, thought of FDR as somewhat of an amateur. He was not really seriously interested in foreign affairs, and he took the advice more of his friends than he did of the professional diplomats.
Okay.
And also in 1943, when we were stationed in Portugal, when he was stationed in Portugal, my father came home and met with FDR personally, but at the end of the meeting, he felt he was sort of unappreciated.
Right.
And then I think the final blow of all this ante was that he really resented not being asked to go to Yalta.
Okay.
And nobody contacted him about Yalta or asked him about Yalta, and I think that was very upsetting to him.
Yes, I mean, I could still see in my one conversation with him that the feelings were pretty strong in that era. One of the most fascinating things about your book, and goes into, I didn't understand the mechanics until I really read, but I guess in '67, Stalin's daughter defects. She was in India, and then she defects, and the Americans want someone to check out if that story is true, if she really is Stalin's daughter. So they send your father on a plane to Switzerland to meet with her, and then later you are asked, after a variety of reasons, because of the first person she was with, she sort of fell out with, to sort of take care of Stalin's daughter and have this fascinating time. Could you discuss that aspect, and if I summarized it correctly?
You've summarized it very well.
Okay.
Yes, except, so basically what my father had offered was our family farm in of all places, East Berlin, Pennsylvania. And she, of course, originally turned it down. Then she fell out with the people she was staying with, and she announced at very short notice that she was ready to come to the farm. It was summer, and my parents always went to Norway in the summer because of my Norwegian mother, and she was not giving up Norway for Svetlana Stalin. So they went off to Norway, and my sister Joan took care, and her then husband Larry Griggs took care of Svetlana before I did, and then I came and took care of her. But when Joan, who had 2 small boys, but I had 3 small children, and when Joan and her husband went off to study, to take a course on being in the Peace Corps, I was asked if I would look after her 2 boys as well as my 3. So when Svetlana arrived, it was wonderful, except I had 5 children and Svetlana. And this definitely colored the whole trip because all those children had to be fed 3 meals a day. I was not allowed to have any help in the house. It's a large house, because my father was really afraid that this was going to be another Trotsky, and somehow the Russians were going to find her, and she was going to be kidnapped and killed or abducted, or so we couldn't have anybody to help clean, help do anything, and so I was kind of overburdened, to put it mildly. Yeah. And we didn't even have modern conveniences. We didn't have a washer. We didn't have a dryer. All the laundry had to be taken into East Berlin, where I put little dimes in those days it was a dime, in machines. And then you had to wait and go back and move it from the washer to the dryer, well, you could imagine. So this trip, I've been so excited about being with Svetlana Stalin, and I had a new notebook, and I was going to write all our conversations, and I really felt I'd had this amazing opportunity, and in a way I did have an amazing opportunity, but in another way, just because of the mechanics of the situation, I spent an awful lot of time just trying to keep this household running forward.
Yes.
And so it was kind of funny. And when I tell the story, people laugh, but it wasn't exactly what I had in mind. I did get to know her, of course. I mean, I lived with her for 3 weeks. But just the same, it wasn't quite what I'd imagined.
It's sort of interesting because I've read Beria's son's book, Sergio Beria, who was, of course, Stalin's head of the secret police, head of the KGB. And what she says, in talking to you, as I understand it, is that she blames all of the stuff that's attributed to Stalin to basically Beria and basically absolve.
Oh, she did.
Yeah.
She and I talked about that. Yes, we did actually have some serious talks, but it was just not half as many as I wanted, put it that way.
Well, yeah, you had your hands full doing all the work, and as you said, she wasn't willing to really contribute much, and she was kind of like the princess raised in this strange childhood.
Well, she was the Kremlin princess. She wasn't going to start drying dishes on my watch anyway.
And then you said she turned on you later, and then she called you up, in the 70s or something, but she basically had a habit of basically turning on everyone, right, who she was close to?
Yeah, I was the first Kennan she turned on, but later one after another, she turned on everybody, and then she would go back. In other words, many years after she wasn't speaking to me, I suddenly had a phone call for her. She was in Princeton. Did I want to come by and see her daughter, Olga? And I said, fine. Yeah. And I did go by.
Yeah, is Olga still alive today?
Yes, she lives under a different name in, I believe, out in the state of Washington.
Interesting. It's kind of like, as I understand it, MacArthur's son lives in New York City under a different name, too, because he wanted nothing to do with the fame of General Douglas MacArthur. So I would love to, of course, track her down, but that's for another program. So you have this interesting experience, and, of course, I didn't even get to your marriages. Your second husband was sort of like the architect for the Kennedy family, right? He did the grave for President Kennedy, and he knew Jackie.
Mm-hmm. He did.
And through that, you were able to take Ted Kennedy to the Soviet Union, right? You sort of acted as his translator, and later Joan Baez.
Yes, well, Joan Baez had nothing to do with the Kennedys.
Right.
that was not a Kennedy connection at all. I did take Joan Baez to Russia, and it was an amazing, wonderful trip. And she is such a beautiful singer. And
your trip with Ted Kennedy, when you took him, with positive experiences from that and enjoyed?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and we met with Brezhnev. I mean, how often do you get to meet ahead of the whole Soviet Union? And I remember walking through the Kremlin and walking up that path to go up to his where his offices were, and I had goosebumps the whole time.
That's, as I understand, Brezhnev could be kind of a playful person, and he had a car collection, and he had interest in Western movies and TV shows, and including.
Yeah, well, we did not discuss Western movies or TV shows. I mean, this was kind of a serious meeting, and Kennedy had, a list of serious things he wanted to accomplish.
Right.
And we were only with them for the first half hour, maybe, of this meeting, and then Joan and the children and I took her away because he had his own translator, Brezhnev.
One of the other...
And
sorry.
What?
One of the other very interesting meetings that you had too is you met with Vladimir Putin when you were doing consulting in Moscow, right, in the early '90s, and he was deputy mayor, and you had a meeting with him.
Yes, I did. In fact, I met with him alone for about 20 to 25 minutes, and I think I'm one of the few people that can say that. I had my own consulting firm called Sovas Business Consultants. I was president of it. It was a very small firm, but I was president. And I had a client who wanted to do something with the port of St. Petersburg. And I was very proud because I had an appointment with the mayor, whose name was Sobchak. And I was, I'd gotten this appointment, and I was feeling very good, and I was doing such a good job. And then at the last minute, they said, Sobchak's been called away on business, and you mind, you're going to have to meet with the deputy mayor, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Well, I knew he was KGB. That's all I knew. And I was put out because that's not who I wanted to meet with. I think he was equally put out. He didn't want to meet with some woman who headed some business thing. I don't think he was used to dealing with women in that position. And we talked for about 20, and we talked in Russian. He didn't speak English in those days. Or if he did speak English, he wouldn't speak English. I don't know the complete answer to that. So we spoke in Russian, and of course I didn't get anything I wanted. And then I guess the meeting, you might say in that sense, was a failure, but in another sense, I'm one of the few people who had that kind of meeting with Putin.
And you said his eyes were the coldest eyes you had seen. Kind of like what McCain said, right? Looking into it, they seemed like cold to you. Is that right?
They were the coldest eyes I've ever seen. And all I could think of, people always say, what did you talk about? And all I can think of, I knew he was KGB, and I looked in those eyes, and I thought, my God, if he was interrogating me, how would I feel?
Right.
And I know I would have been terrified.
Right. I want to ask you more about your life, but just since we talk about Putin, just one question about that. I mean, you obviously, like your father, you speak fluent Russian. You're very knowledgeable in the country, so I think you're a good person to ask about this, and also maybe what your father would think too, if you could answer that. But do you think in some ways it's more dangerous today with Putin than it was under, say, a Brezhnev? Because Putin is kind of like the de facto czar of Russia. There really is no Politburo checking him the way there was with Brezhnev, and even to a degree with Stalin's. I mean, and so in some ways, is it more dangerous today than it was in prior Soviet leaders?
Well, I'm not sure that it's, first of all, I'm not sure that, I don't think Stalin had very many people checking him either. He had really unlimited power. Brezhnev did, you're right, but, no, I think Putin's a bit risk-averse, really.
You do?
Sounds funny, yeah. In other words, he took over Crimea, but he knew we weren't going to do anything about it.
Okay.
What was he going to lose?
So you don't see him invading the Baltic states or something like that?
People in the Baltic states are truly worried about it, and I've talked to quite a lot of them. I don't think he's going to personally, but, I mean, I hope to God that I'm right.
You did work in Ukraine, right? You did work for Empowering Women after your consulting?
I had a project that was funded by USAID on women's economic empowerment. Mm-hmm.
And how long?
I helped start small businesses, and I was there for 4.5 years.
Interesting. And then later, could you tell us about your work with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy when you got involved?
Well,
with that?
I was acting president and chairman and I was chairman of the board for 5 years.
And
of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, which is a very good, I think, think tank that's based in New York City. We have programs, so if anybody's interested, they're more than welcome to come. And then we do a lot of Track 2 diplomacy, particularly in Southeast Asia.
What is Track 2 diplomacy versus Track 1?
Track 2 diplomacy is when you meet secretly with people from with other countries with whom you can't have certain meetings in the open. For example, and it's been in the paper, so I'm not divulging any secret, we have done a lot of work in bringing China and Taiwan together. Interesting.
And the website is ncafp.org, if I recall. Is that right?
Yes, NCAFP, National Committee on American Foreign Policy.
Yes, and they also did work on the Northern Ireland, I believe, the peace process too, and facilitating.
We did a lot of work on Northern Ireland, and we were I think we were by far the most influential nonprofit that worked on that. And we worked on it for many, many years. Getting
Jerry Adams to get a visa, I believe, and Ted Kennedy helped with that, too.
We got Jerry Adams' visa. We're all very proud of it.
Right. It's almost like the shadow head of the IRA and sort of a controversial figure, but obviously...
And we're doing, we keep working. I mean, whenever there's something that's delicate like that, it's where we sort of shine.
Yes, absolutely. So just, if I could, your father, I believe, passed away in 2004. Is that right?
No, 2005.
2005. Sorry. So he was around for the 9/11 attacks. Was he living in Princeton at that time? Because that's when I dropped him off in 88.
He was living in Princeton, but I was living in Ukraine.
You living in Ukraine?
I couldn't even reach them.
Yes, that's because it was an anniversary party for them, right? If I recall, you were saying you were going to go to.
It was their wedding anniversary. They were married on September 11th.
So your father, as we discussed earlier, he was had this liberal bent to him, and he was averse to war and seen all this suffering. But of course, he was old enough to go through so much, and of course, see 9/11 happen. What was his? Did he give you any opinions on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and what he thought our policy should be there? Did he talk to you at all about that?
Well, those were the years that I was living in Ukraine, and we really didn't talk very much about it. I mean, he was always horrified by war. And I'm not sure that he, looking back on it, I would guess he didn't totally approve of those wars. But I'm not going to misspeak, and I'm really. It was something we didn't talk about very much.
Is it your opinion, just yours personally, that we should still be in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that we should keep some troops in Syria, or do you have any opinions on that?
Well, I think that. I think we should have never gone in the first place.
Right.
That's where I think. And now it's more difficult. But, I mean, we can't have troops everywhere in the world and keep having them forever and ever. But it's causing a lot of trouble right now.
Having had such an interesting father as you did, and having had such an interesting life as you have, and seen so much in your life, and you look at the world today, which we don't have a Hitler and we don't have a Stalin, but we have so much disarray and chaos, and we just recently defeated ISIS, but we have this new Islamic fundamentalism and problems that didn't exist when you were dealing with the problems in the 40s and your father was. Do you think that we're overall still in a better state of the world today than it was when you were growing up and going through the 40s and 50s?
Well, I don't know whether to say it's in a better state or a worse state. It's perhaps in a more confusing state.
Okay.
Because it's much easier when you just have one enemy.
Right.
It's us and the Russians, and that was very simple. Anybody could sort of understand that, and you could feel pro or sympathetic or anti-Russian, but we just had the one enemy. Now we have China, which is rapidly going to probably surpass Russia and surpass, God knows who else. It's growing. Even though the growth has slowed, it's still growing very rapidly. And we have different enemies. We're in a more complex world, and I think that is difficult for people to understand.
And I'm sure your father would probably find it, I think he would have probably found it confusing. The world being more confusing than the world that he dealt with in the 40s?
Well, he had a very sharp mind. If he was alive and not 110 or something, I think he would come up with some very interesting thoughts about the world now.
I'm sure he would have.
The world then was what the world then was.
Well, Grace Kennan Warnke, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the program today, and your book, Daughter of the Cold War, and the website for the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And thank you so much for talking to us and sharing your fascinating father's views and talking about your life.
Well, thank you for having me, Ralph. It was interesting to talk about it.
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
When military service members head into battle,